The property had never been meant for conflict. It sat quietly at the edge of a fading rural subdivision, where the paved roads ended and gravel took over, where silence still carried the weight of something honest. A narrow creek cut through the land like a scar that time had softened, and over it stretched a small wooden bridge. Hand-built, modest, and never intended for anything heavier than a pickup truck or a neighbor's passing glance. For years, the bridge had done its job without complaint. It connected two halves of a single piece of land, allowing simple access between the main house and a stretch of open field that rolled out toward a cluster of old oak trees. It was private, personal, and most importantly, it was not part of any shared roadway or easement. That was before the subdivision expanded. The homeowners association arrived like a storm dressed in paperwork. It brought new rules, new faces, and a quiet but unmistakable sense of control. At the center of it all stood the HOA's leadership, led by a woman whose presence carried more authority than reason. She had the kind of confidence that ignored boundaries, both physical and legal, and she treated the entire neighborhood as if it were hers to command. The expansion project started just beyond the far end of the creek, on land that had once been empty. Developers carved out lots, laid foundations, and brought in machinery that seemed too large for the peaceful setting. Cement trucks, heavy equipment, and construction crews became a daily sight. At first, everything seemed contained. The trucks used the designated access road, the one built specifically to handle their weight. But that road took longer, looping around the property instead of cutting straight through. And that was where the problem began. One morning, the rumble of something unnatural echoed through the property. It wasn't the distant hum of construction. It was closer, heavier, wrong. By the time the source became visible, it was already too late. A cement truck, massive and indifferent, was rolling across the small wooden bridge as if it had every right to be there. The structure groaned under the weight. The moment stretched thin with tension, wood creaking, bolts straining, the entire bridge seeming to hold its breath. Somehow, it held. The truck crossed and disappeared toward the construction site, leaving behind nothing but tire marks and a deep, unsettling silence. It didn't feel like a mistake. That first crossing might have been written off as confusion, a driver taking a wrong turn. But it happened again, and again. Each time, the trucks grew bolder, more frequent, as if the bridge had silently been claimed as part of their route. The damage began to show quickly. The wood, once sturdy and reliable, started to splinter under the repeated strain. Hairline cracks appeared along the support beams. The railing leaned slightly, no longer perfectly straight. Every crossing left the bridge weaker than before, pushing it closer to a breaking point that felt inevitable. Attempts to address the issue started simply. Complaints were filed, messages were sent, and warnings were issued. The problem wasn't subtle, and the risk was obvious. The bridge was not designed for industrial traffic, and its collapse would not just be costly. It would be dangerous. But the response from the HOA was dismissive. The leadership treated the concerns as exaggerated, almost inconvenient. They framed the situation as temporary, a necessary inconvenience for the sake of progress. The construction needed efficiency, and the shorter route across the bridge saved time. In their eyes, that was enough justification. Private property lines blurred under their reasoning. What made it worse was the quiet confidence behind their decisions. They acted as if authority alone gave them ownership, as if the existence of the HOA meant every path, every structure, every inch of land could be repurposed to fit their needs. The bridge became more than just a crossing. It became a symbol of something being taken. Days turned into weeks, and the tension grew heavier with every truck that passed. Each crossing felt like a deliberate act, a statement that the property no longer belonged entirely to its owner. The sound of engines became a warning, a reminder that control was slipping away piece by piece. But beneath the frustration, something else was forming. Observation replaced reaction. Patterns began to emerge. The timing of the trucks, the routes they favored, the blind spots in their approach. Every detail started to matter, not out of curiosity but out of necessity, because the situation was no longer just about damage. It was about defiance. And defiance, when ignored long enough, had a way of turning into something far more calculated. By the end of the third week, the bridge stood worn but still intact, like a line drawn in the dirt that had been crossed too many times. The assumption from the HOA was clear. They believed nothing would stop them. That assumption would prove to be their first mistake. As the rumble of another truck echoed in the distance, a quiet realization settled in. If they refused to respect the boundary, then the boundary would have to enforce itself, and that was where the plan began. The pattern became impossible to ignore. What had once felt like a series of isolated incidents now revealed itself as a calculated routine. The cement trucks no longer hesitated at the edge of the property. They no longer slowed as they approached the narrow wooden bridge. Instead, they drove across it with a confidence that suggested permission had already been granted, whether it truly had been or not. Each crossing carried the same consequences. The wood groaned louder, the supports sagged deeper, and the entire structure seemed to absorb the punishment in silence. It was no longer just a matter of inconvenience. The bridge was being systematically destroyed under the weight of decisions made far beyond its capacity. The homeowners association, however, remained unmoved. Their leadership had grown more assertive, more dismissive of any objections. What began as indifference evolved into something sharper, a sense of authority that bordered on entitlement. The situation was no longer being treated as a misunderstanding. It was being enforced as a decision. The reasoning was always the same: efficiency, progress, development. Words that sounded reasonable on paper but carried no respect for the boundaries they were violating. The shorter route saved time for the construction crews, and in the eyes of the HOA, that benefit outweighed everything else. The private bridge had been unofficially reclassified as a solution to their problem. The shift in tone became evident in the notices that followed. Formal letters began to appear, filled with carefully structured language that attempted to justify the continued use of the bridge. They referenced vague clauses, hinted at shared responsibilities, and implied that resistance could lead to penalties. It was a tactic designed to create pressure. But pressure worked both ways. The physical condition of the bridge told a different story than the letters. Splinters had begun to scatter along the planks. The once straight boards now dipped slightly under even moderate weight. Beneath the surface, the foundation was weakening in ways that could not be easily repaired. And still, the trucks kept coming. What made the situation more dangerous was the complete lack of oversight. No inspections were conducted. No reinforcements were offered. The HOA showed no interest in maintaining the structure they had chosen to rely on. Their involvement extended only as far as using it. Responsibility was ignored. That imbalance shifted something internally. The frustration that had once driven direct complaints began to evolve into something quieter, more deliberate. Instead of reacting to each crossing, attention turned toward understanding the system behind it. The timing of the trucks became predictable. Early mornings saw the first wave, heavy with fresh loads. Midday brought a steady flow, while late afternoons carried the final crossings before the site shut down for the evening. The drivers followed the same path, entering from the same angle, rarely deviating from their routine. Consistency created opportunity. The surrounding area was studied with the same precision. The creek beneath the bridge wasn't deep, but its banks were uneven, lined with soft soil that shifted easily under pressure. The approach to the bridge itself had been worn down by repeated traffic, creating subtle grooves in the ground that guided each vehicle into place. It was a system built on repetition, and repetition made it fragile. Meanwhile, the HOA's confidence continued to grow. Their leadership carried on as if the matter had already been settled, as if the absence of immediate consequences meant permanent acceptance. There was no attempt to negotiate, no effort to compromise. They had mistaken silence for surrender, but the silence had a purpose. Preparation had begun in small, almost invisible ways. Measurements were taken, not with tools, but with observation. Distances were noted. Angles were considered. Even the sound of the trucks approaching became a form of information, a signal that helped map out the rhythm of their movements. Nothing was left to chance, because this was no longer about stopping a single truck or filing another complaint that would be ignored. It was about addressing the root of the problem, the assumption that the bridge could be used without consequence. That assumption needed to be challenged. The idea didn't form all at once. It developed gradually, shaped by every crossing, every crack in the wood, every dismissive response from the HOA. It was an answer built not from impulse, but from patience. And patience had its limits. By the end of the 4th week, the bridge had reached a point where failure felt inevitable. The only question that remained was when, and under what circumstances, it would happen. That was no longer something to leave to chance. Because if the HOA believed the bridge could handle anything they sent across it, then that belief would soon be tested in a way they could not ignore. And when it happened, it wouldn't be an accident. By the time the 4th week came to a close, the bridge no longer felt like a structure. It felt like a countdown. Every passing truck added weight not just to the wood beneath its tires, but to the growing certainty that something had to give. The damage was no longer subtle. It had crossed into the kind of visible deterioration that could no longer be explained away as temporary strain. The surface planks had begun to separate in places, leaving thin, uneven gaps that caught light at certain angles. The support beams underneath, once firm and straight, now carried a slight bend, the kind that spoke of fatigue rather than flexibility. Even the sound of the bridge had changed. It no longer creaked. It groaned, a low, drawn-out warning that lingered long after each truck had passed. Still, the crossings continued. The HOA had settled into a rhythm of control so complete that the bridge had effectively become part of their operation. There was no hesitation in their actions, no sign that they recognized the growing risk. If anything, their confidence had turned into something closer to indifference, as though the outcome no longer mattered as long as progress continued. That indifference became the final confirmation. The plan that had been forming in silence began to take shape with clarity. It wasn't about confrontation in the traditional sense. Direct arguments had already proven useless, dismissed with legal language and empty authority. What was needed was something that couldn't be ignored, something that would force acknowledgement not through words, but through consequence. The first step was understanding exactly how much the bridge could still IV thick. Observation turned into quiet testing. Light pressure was applied in controlled ways, never enough to cause immediate failure, but enough to reveal the bridge's remaining strength. Each step, each shift of weight, told a story about what the structure could endure and where it would eventually break. The weak points were no longer hidden. They existed near the center span, where the repeated stress of the trucks had worn down the internal supports. From above, the damage appeared manageable. But beneath the surface, the structure had hollowed in critical places, leaving it vulnerable to a precise kind of strain. That vulnerability became the focus. Attention shifted to the approach leading onto the bridge. The worn grooves in the soil had deepened over time, guiding each truck into the same narrow path. The drivers, accustomed to the routine, relied on these tracks without question. It created a predictable entry point, one that could be influenced without drawing attention. Small adjustments began to appear. The ground near the entrance was subtly altered, just enough to shift the alignment of incoming vehicles by a fraction. It wasn't noticeable to someone driving a heavy truck, but it was enough to change how the weight would distribute once they reached the bridge. Precision replaced randomness. At the same time, the bridge itself was prepared in ways that blended seamlessly with its existing damage. No sudden changes, no obvious tampering, only careful modifications that followed the natural pattern of wear. To an untrained eye, nothing looked different, but structurally, everything had changed. The balance had been rewritten. The timing became the final piece. The trucks followed a schedule that had grown almost mechanical in its consistency. Among them, one stood out, a fully loaded cement truck that made its crossing during the late morning, carrying more weight than the others. It moved slower, heavier, pressing down on the bridge with a force that pushed the structure closer to its limits than any other vehicle. That truck would be the test. The decision wasn't made out of recklessness. It was calculated, built on weeks of observation and an understanding of exactly how the system functioned. The goal wasn't destruction for its own sake. It was exposure, a demonstration that the bridge was not an endless resource, and that ignoring its limits came with consequences. The morning of the test arrived without announcement. Everything appeared normal. The construction site buzzed in the distance. The HOA continued its operations without interruption. The bridge sat quietly in place, unchanged to anyone who wasn't looking closely. But beneath that stillness, everything was ready. As the distant rumble of the heavier truck began to echo across the property, a quiet certainty settled in. This wasn't about stopping one crossing, it was about ending all of them. Because once the line beneath the surface was crossed, there would be no pretending it had never been there. And when the moment came, it would change everything. The late morning air carried a stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if the land itself had paused in anticipation. Nothing outwardly appeared different. The creek flowed as it always had, slow and indifferent. The bridge stood in place, worn and strained, yet outwardly unchanged. Even the distant construction site moved with its usual rhythm, machines humming, workers focused, everything operating under the assumption of routine. Then the sound came, low at first, barely noticeable, but growing steadily into the unmistakable rumble of heavy machinery. The fully loaded cement truck approached on schedule, just as it had every day before. Its presence wasn't questioned, wasn't challenged. It followed the same worn path, its tires settling naturally into the grooves carved by weeks of repetition. There was no hesitation. The truck aligned itself with the bridge, guided by habit more than awareness. The slight shift in the approach went unnoticed, too subtle to trigger caution. From the driver's perspective, nothing had changed. The bridge was simply another part of the route, another crossing that had never failed. Until now, the front wheels rolled onto the wooden planks, and the familiar strain began. The structure responded as it always did, creaking, bending slightly under the weight. For a brief moment, everything appeared normal, as though the crossing would continue without incident. But the balance had already been altered. As the truck moved forward, its weight settled differently, concentrated in a way the bridge was no longer capable of EVDA. The weakened supports beneath the center span absorbed the force unevenly, their compromised structure unable to distribute the load as they once had. The sound changed. What had once been a steady groan turned into something sharper, more abrupt, a crack that cut through the air with undeniable finality. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct enough to signal that something had gone wrong. The truck continued forward for a fraction of a second longer. Then the bridge gave way. The collapse wasn't explosive. It was sudden, controlled by the very weaknesses that had been building over time. The center section dropped first, the support snapping under pressure, pulling the surrounding planks down with it. The rear of the truck dipped sharply, its massive weight forcing the structure to surrender completely. The vehicle lurched, its back end sinking into the broken frame, while the front remained partially on solid ground. The entire scene froze in a moment of imbalance, half suspended, half collapsed, caught between stability and failure. Silence followed. The construction site, once filled with constant noise, seemed to pause as the reality of what had just happened spread outward. Workers turned their attention toward the bridge, their movements slowing, their expressions shifting from routine focus to uncertain recognition. The crossing had finally reached its limit. But the response from the HOA was not what might have been expected. Denial came first. Rather than acknowledging the obvious structural failure, the leadership framed the incident as an unforeseen accident, an isolated event that could not have been predicted. Their statements carried the same tone of authority as before, attempting to control the narrative even as the evidence lay broken beneath the truck. Responsibility was avoided with precision. There were suggestions that the bridge had been poorly constructed, that it had failed to meet necessary standards. The repeated use by heavy vehicles was minimized, described as occasional rather than constant. The damage, they implied, was not a result of their decisions, but of an inherent flaw that had finally revealed itself. But the physical reality told a different story. The broken beams, the splintered wood, the collapsed center span, all of it reflected the cumulative impact of weeks of strain. This was not a sudden failure. It was the inevitable result of sustained pressure, ignored warnings, and deliberate disregard for limits that had been clearly defined from the beginning. And that truth could not be hidden. The truck remained where it had fallen, a massive, undeniable presence trapped within the remains of the bridge. It was no longer just a vehicle. It was evidence, a visible consequence of decisions made without accountability. The balance of control had shifted. What had once been treated as a private inconvenience was now a public problem. The HOA could no longer operate as if the bridge were an extension of their authority. The collapse had drawn attention, not just from those involved, but from the wider community that had begun to take notice. And with attention came questions, the kind that could not be dismissed with formal language or vague justifications. Because the bridge had not simply failed. It had exposed something much larger. The aftermath of the collapse did not unfold quietly. What had once been a contained issue, dismissed and overlooked by the HOA, now spread outward with a force that could not be managed through silence or carefully worded statements. The image of the cement truck, stranded in the broken remains of the bridge, became impossible to ignore, a physical representation of everything that had been denied for weeks. The construction site slowed almost immediately. Without the bridge, the shortcut that had quietly supported their efficiency vanished. Trucks were forced to reroute along the longer access road, creating delays that rippled through the entire project. What had once been a matter of convenience was now a logistical problem, one that cost time, money, and coordination. The impact was immediate, and it was felt by everyone involved. But the real shift wasn't in the construction schedule. It was in perception. Neighbors who had once remained distant from the situation began to pay attention. The constant crossings, the noise, the visible wear on the property, details that had gone unnoticed or unchallenged before were now being reconsidered. The collapse had reframed the entire situation, turning what the HOA had presented as progress into something far more questionable. The narrative was no longer under their control. The HOA leadership attempted to regain footing quickly. Notices were issued, statements circulated, each one carefully structured to minimize their involvement. The collapse was described as unfortunate, a result of circumstances rather than decisions. There were mentions of reviewing policies, of ensuring safety moving forward, but none of it addressed the core issue. Accountability remained absent. Instead, attention was redirected. There were subtle attempts to shift responsibility back toward the property itself. Questions were raised about permits, about construction standards, about whether the bridge had ever been formally approved. It was a strategy designed to create doubt, to blur the line between cause and consequence. But the timeline told a clearer story. The repeated use of the bridge by heavy trucks had not been a secret. It had been visible, consistent, and documented through the damage left behind. The cracks, the sagging supports, the gradual deterioration. None of it had appeared overnight. It had developed over time, under conditions that the HOA had not only allowed but effectively encouraged. And now, the consequences were equally visible. The stranded truck became the focal point of everything. It sat lodged within the collapsed structure, its weight pressing into the broken wood, refusing to be easily removed. Efforts to extract it were slow and complicated, requiring additional equipment and careful planning. Each attempt drew more attention, more observation, more awareness of the situation. It was no longer something that could be hidden. The presence of outside parties began to grow. Inspectors, contractors, and other professionals were brought in, each one evaluating the damage from their own perspective. Their assessments added layers of credibility to what had already become obvious. The bridge had not failed on its own. It had been pushed beyond its limits. That conclusion carried weight. The HOA's position began to weaken under the accumulation of facts. Their earlier confidence, their dismissal of concerns, their reliance on authority, all of it started to erode as the situation unfolded beyond their control. What had once been presented as a minor inconvenience now stood as a clear example of mismanagement. The balance had shifted completely. For the first time, the HOA was reacting instead of directing. Their decisions were no longer shaping the outcome, they were responding to it. Every move they made was influenced by the growing scrutiny surrounding them, and every attempt to deflect responsibility only seemed to reinforce the reality they were trying to avoid. The property itself, once treated as an extension of their influence, had become the boundary they could no longer cross. And the bridge, in its broken state, had become something far more powerful than it had ever been intact. It had become proof. Proof that control without accountability had limits. Proof that boundaries, when ignored long enough, would eventually enforce themselves. And most importantly, proof that the narrative could change, no matter how firmly it had been held before. But the story wasn't over, because while the collapse had forced the HOA into a defensive position, it had also set the stage for what would come next, and what followed would determine whether they could recover, or whether the consequences would extend far beyond a single broken bridge. The final phase of the conflict did not arrive with noise or spectacle. It unfolded slowly, methodically, as the weight of everything that had happened settled into place. The broken bridge remained at the center of it all, not as an obstacle anymore, but as a permanent marker of where authority had gone too far and reality had pushed back. The cement truck was eventually removed, but not without difficulty. Heavy machinery was brought in, carefully maneuvering around the unstable remains of the structure. The process took time, requiring precision and caution, as the risk of further collapse still lingered. Every movement reinforced the same undeniable truth. The situation had escalated far beyond what anyone had anticipated, and it had done so because boundaries had been ignored. Once the truck was gone, what remained was even more revealing. The full extent of the damage could finally be seen without obstruction. The center span of the bridge had completely given way, its supports shattered, its foundation compromised beyond simple repair. It was no longer a structure that could be fixed. It was one that would have to be rebuilt entirely, and that raised the question no one could avoid anymore. Who was responsible? The HOA could no longer rely on vague language or carefully framed statements. Too many people had seen what happened. Too many had followed the timeline, understood the pattern, and recognized the role that repeated crossings had played in weakening the bridge. The earlier attempts to shift blame now felt hollow, disconnected from the reality that had unfolded in plain sight. External evaluations confirmed what had already become obvious. The bridge had not failed due to poor design or hidden defects. It had failed because it had been subjected to loads far beyond its intended capacity, repeatedly and without reinforcement. The evidence was clear, supported by visible damage and consistent usage patterns. The responsibility was no longer abstract. It pointed directly at the decisions that had been made and ignored. Over the previous weeks, the HOA's position became increasingly difficult to maintain. Their authority, once used to dismiss concerns, now placed them at the center of accountability. Every action they had taken, every warning they had overlooked, now carried consequences that could not be undone. Financial implications followed quickly. The cost of removing the truck, assessing the damage, and preparing for reconstruction began to add up. What had once been seen as a convenient shortcut had turned into an expensive mistake. The idea of efficiency used to justify the use of the bridge had collapsed along with it. And unlike before, these costs could not be passed off or ignored. The narrative had shifted too far. Within the community, the perception of the HOA changed in a way that could not easily be repaired. The confidence they once projected now appeared misplaced, even reckless. Their control over the neighborhood, once unquestioned, was now viewed through a different lens, one that emphasized overreach rather than leadership. Trust had been damaged in a way that mirrored the bridge itself. Rebuilding it would take more than materials and time. In the end, the resolution came not through confrontation, but through inevitability. The facts had accumulated, the evidence had spoken, and the outcome had followed naturally from both. The HOA was left with no choice but to accept responsibility, whether openly or through the actions they were now required to take. The bridge would be rebuilt. But it would not be the same. Stronger materials would replace the old wood. Reinforced supports would ensure that it could handle far more than it ever had before. And most importantly, its purpose would be clearly defined and protected in a way that could not be ignored or reinterpreted. It would no longer be vulnerable to assumption. The conflict itself left a lasting impression, one that extended beyond the property lines. It became a reminder of what happens when authority operates without limits, when decisions are made without respect for the structures, both physical and legal, that they affect. Because in the end, the bridge had done more than collapse. It had forced a reckoning, and that reckoning had changed everything. The crossings had stopped, the control had shifted, and the line that had once been ignored now stood clearer than ever before. Some boundaries, once tested, do not bend again.